My first book was on the rural community of Covert, Michigan. Starting in the 1860s, the people of this place broke both laws and social expectations to develop a community of radical equality. Schools and churches were completely integrated, blacks and whites married, and power and wealth were shared between the races. Together, over the next 50 years, these residents of Covert, Michigan continued to shatter the legal and social barriers to black equality. When I went on book tour, people kept coming up to me afterwards and asking, have you heard of this community or that particular community? And I hadn't. And I went to the historical records and I began to realize that it seemed that almost no one had heard of these communities. So I started to dig, which is what historians do. We're at heart very nosy people. And I began uncovering all of these African-American pioneers and farmers living across the rural 19th century Midwest. Indeed, I have found almost 70 communities so far, and my research on these African-American pioneers and the communities they created will be the basis of a permanent exhibit at the Smithsonian's new National Museum of African-American History and Culture. This antebellum movement of mainly free African Americans into the old Northwest Territory states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin in the first half of the 19th century was truly our first great migration, and the movement was large. By 1860, over 63,000 African Americans were living in those old Northwest Territory states. But unlike the Great Migration of the 20th century, this one was an overwhelmingly rural-to-rural movement, which makes sense because before the Industrial Revolution, the way to really get ahead in this nation was to own good land and farm it. Now, most of these communities I have found were not like Covert, Michigan. Indeed, the Midwest, then known as the West, this was the frontier. I know it's hard to think of Ohio as the West. At one point it was actually home to terrible, terrible racism. However, I was stunned to find that there were many examples of integration, equality, and race amity in these rural regions. Indeed, the first African American to be elected to any office in this nation was John Langston in 1855 in rural Brownhelm County, Ohio. And I have found multiple examples of communities where African Americans were some of the first on the frontier, admittedly, a frontier that had just been, or was being, brutally cleared of its rightful residents, the First Nations in the land, but still the frontier. This meant that whites following into these areas had to decide whether they wanted to have black neighbors. Many didn't, but some did. And when they did, what blacks and whites accomplished together was truly astounding. One of my favorite stories at the moment is of the Union Literary Institute. This was founded in 1845 in rural Randolph County, Indiana, right on the border of Ohio. Unlike Oberlin, which of course is justly famous for its integration in the 19th century, the Union Literary Institute was actually founded by a diverse group of people. Oberlin was founded by whites. The Union Literary Institute was actually founded by whites and African Americans. The land was donated by a wealthy African American farmer, and much of the money for this school came from African American farmers in the area. Its first president, William Clemens, was African American, and astonishingly enough, its charter in 1845 said that students could attend, irregardless, so it didn't matter what their color, rank, wealth, gender, or religion was, which was truly revolutionary at that time. By 1850, 131 students were enrolled in this school, 73% of them of African descent. Now, when my first book on Covert came out, I had some folks, including a lot of academics, accusing me of having rosy-colored glasses. Like, come on, look, we're dealing with the 19th century Midwest. Sure, Covert existed, but there was a lot of terrible things that were going on. And of course there were. But looking at examples of race amity is not obscuring injustice, and I want to stress this. Instead, it's trying to overcome an assumption that I think a lot of people hold, including a lot of academics. This concept that racist whites, or racist folks of any kind, had no option but to be racist. That there were so few examples or arguments that would have even begun to convince people not to be racist, that they just were, But in the examples I have found of African Americans working for and gaining equality with whites, each example shines a light on a dark sorrow. For if race amity was a choice, so was racism. Of course, with an advanced degree in social anthropology, I know that most groups of homogeneous people in the world have an almost immediate response to difference. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. But that response does not have to be unjust, exploitative, or deadly. It can be thoughtful, just, peaceful, and hopefully triumphant.
So that's a little clip from my documentary, Rebel Hearts, the Grimke Sisters of South Carolina. And the interviewee there is the great historian Gerda Lerner, who recently left us. She died a couple of years ago, but she was a great feminist historian, and I was so lucky to have met her and to be able to interview her. I first heard about the Grimke Sisters when I was perusing the stacks in the New York Public Library, and I had not heard of them, and being from South Carolina, I was surprised, although now that I have lived there longer, I'm not really surprised anymore, because that history of South Carolina isn't as well known still as it should be. But I was so moved by the story of these two women from a wealthy slaveholding white family in Charleston, South Carolina, who left the South, moved to Philadelphia, and became actively involved in the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was a biracial coalition of activists, and toured the Northeast giving fiery speeches against slavery. And they were propelled really by the horrors that they knew so well from having grown up in Charleston. And this was the late 18th, early 19th century. And they ended up in the Northeast in the 1830s. And as they spoke to groups of mixed gender in the North, because it was actually considered to be scandalous if you were a woman at that time to speak to men and women in public. As they toured and gave these speeches, they realized that the rights of all were completely intertwined. And they began to develop feminist ideas and really set the groundwork for the women's suffrage movement, which, as you know, came decades later. So I have a few notes here, and I'm, like Annalisa, I'm going to refer to them because I could go on and on, but I will try to restrain myself. I wanted to mention that the Grimke sisters stand out as white South Carolinians, but they certainly were not alone in a tradition of race amity in the South and in South Carolina. And I wanted to mention another great South Carolinian, the great Federal Circuit Court Judge J. Wadis Waring. And he was the judge before whom Thurgood Marshall appeared with the Briggs versus Elliott case. Briggs versus Elliott was one of the cases that went on to become Brown versus Board of Education. And Thurgood Marshall appeared in front of J. Wadis Waring, and he said, we realize we are separate, but we want to be equal. And Waring said, if you're separate, you can't be equal. And he said, go back and file a brief that challenges segregation itself. His great quote was, as long as you have separate, you'll never have equal. And J. Wadis Waring is another unsung hero of South Carolina. So there are lots of other examples of blacks and whites working together in the South. And it's just a great privilege to be here and be able to talk about this with you. As you know, I lived in the North for a long time, and I do sometimes feel that people in the North disregard the South in a way, or feel that, well, nothing good really ever happens there. And I understand why that is. There is, today, voter ID laws, a terrible thing. Gerrymandering has created districts in the South that are all white or all black, and making it very hard to elect people across racial lines. The education funding is skewed. Among many people in South Carolina, there is a really seething hostility toward our first black president, which for those of us who believe in race amity causes a lot of pain. But I think the possibilities are great in the South, and I think our shared history has glory in it as well as pain. And I wanted to read you just a short excerpt from a speech that W.E.B. Du Bois gave in Columbia, South Carolina in 1946 to a group called to the closing session of the Southern Youth Legislature of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And in the words of the great Du Bois, he said, "You must remember that you have allies, and allies even in the white South. First and greatest of these possible allies are the white working classes about you, the poor whites whom you have been taught to despise, and who in turn have learned to fear and hate you. This must not deter you from efforts to make them understand, because in the past their ignorance and suffering, they have been led foolishly to look upon you as the cause of most of their distress. You must remember that this attitude is hereditary from slavery, and that it has been deliberately cultivated ever since emancipation. Slowly but surely, the working people of the South, white and black, must come to remember that their emancipation depends upon their mutual cooperation, upon their acquaintanceship with each other, upon their friendship, upon their social intermingling. Unless this happens, each is going to be made the football to break the heads and hearts of the other." Thank you.
What can I tell you? I came to this country in the mid-70s. I like to say that I came to Boston with high hopes and great expectation from the island of Antigua. Most people go to Antigua to escape the cold. I came to Boston. What's wrong with that picture? And I came to Boston having grown up in an environment where people who looked like me were the majority, and they were the people of influence, the doctor, the chief of police, the prime minister, the governor, all of the people who were of significant authority figure were people of African descent. And then I arrived in Boston, having done my homework and about Boston being the cradle of liberty. It's where the abolitionist movement was, the 54th Regiment, Phyllis Wheatley and Frederick Douglass, and Lloyd William Garrison, Martin Luther King went to school here. The Kennedys were from this region, so I really wanted to be in Boston. And then I was here for about a year, and I had to ask myself, am I in Boston, Massachusetts, or Boston, Mississippi? Because it was in the throes of busing. I was 17 years old, and I thought, oh my goodness, what did I do? And so I lived here in Boston, and I have to say that I didn't have any specific negative experience, because when you live on a campus or you live in a college, you're really living in a bubble. I know that we were told as Black students, if you go down to, for those of you who are over 50, if you go downtown near Filene's and Jordan Marsh, don't go south of Jordan Marsh because you'll end up in South Boston. And if you go north of Woolworth, do not go to the north end or to Charlestown. So there were communities in Boston, which this is less than 40 years ago, where people who looked like me couldn't walk safely because they would be attacked. And so I came to Boston, graduated, went back to Antigua, and I must be a glutton for punishment, because I came back to Boston to get my master's degree. I'm thinking, okay. And I came back to Boston. Things had changed somewhat, but not a lot. And I found a lot of people who went to school here, a lot of students who were African American or from the African diaspora, didn't stay in Boston. They left. They went to New York, Chicago, DC, LA, other places, but they didn't stay in Boston. I stayed in Boston. And to a great extent, I think my staying in Boston was my particular calling, because I really firmly believe that sometimes we end up where we need to be, not where we want to be. And while I was here in Boston, I decided that I would start my own business in public relations and marketing. And one of the areas that I decided to focus on was helping corporations understand how to effectively market to diverse cultures. So in 1986, when I was 10, I started the first successful multicultural marketing communications firm in Boston. And we're celebrating our 28th year this year. Yeah. And I thought about it the other day, and I said, when I started my business, there was digital equipment, Wang, and Polaroid, Honeywell Bull. All of those companies are gone, and I'm still in business. So that, to me, is about tenacity. And as I did that, my whole life's work has really been about bringing people together. I like to think of myself, I said when I think of myself, I think it's CCBB, and it's not the Wyman gospel group. It's connecting communities and building bridges. That really is my life's work. And in 2000, I recognized that there was nothing you could go to in Boston, in any directory, that could tell you if you dropped out of Mars and wanted to know what organization served African Americans or Latinos or Brazilians or Caribbean people or Asian people. There was nothing. And I knew that I had access to all of these people just by virtue of the fact that that's the business I chose to be in. And I started I published the first ever multicultural resource directory in Boston called Kaleidoscope. And we did the second edition in 2006, and we are now working on the third edition, moving into the digital space in a mobile app. And then 6 years, fast forward, 6 years ago, I got tired of Boston operating in silos. You had the Irish, the Italian, the Jews, the blacks, the Chinese, you know, the Native Americans, the Caribbean people, and they all had different events and they all had their different gatherings, and very rarely you would see any coming together. And I thought, what would happen in Boston if we created an event where people, professionals and business executives, no matter their ethnicity or background, could come to this event, make connections, build relationships, and expand their networks? What would happen if that? And so in 2008, I started Get Connected. And it started as people coming together, and it has now grown into a really substantive network. And people who know me know that if I cannot change something, I am not gonna criticize it or talk about it. So anything that I see that I feel needs to be changed, I like being the change I want to see in the world, as Gandhi said. And so I want to commend Smitty, because he's like my partner in this. He's an advisor and an ambassador for Get Connected for doing this. I think our country needs more of this. More people getting together and really sharing and discussing. So, thank you, Smitty.
Think of this forum and the work that we all are trying to do. You know, I get a little emotional primarily because I started teaching race relations at Michigan State University in the early 70s. And I taught a course called Racism and Ethnocentrism. I won't go into the details of it. But I was particularly concerned, number one, about how to understand the history of racism. And so I was an instructor and then an assistant professor in a newly formed department of racial and ethnic studies, and taught one of the first courses dealing with the history of racism. And I taught that course for many years, and then later on I started training graduate students. But one of the things that really bothered me, folk, after, let us say, having taught for about 15 years, I noticed that I was doing a very great job in teaching students about the history of racial oppression. They knew a lot about the history of racial oppression. And I also noticed that when they took the final exam, or wrote those master's theses or PhDs, that they seemed to be a little dejected. I wasn't really giving them any handles on which to really deal with the problem. And so I started reflecting on that, not to come up with some artificial parallel historical interpretation, but I started asking myself, I wonder if there are some positive things in American history. I wonder if there's another tradition, okay? And so I got an opportunity when a group of us at Michigan State University started work on a book in the early 80s. It was Detroit, Race and Uneven Development. And you all know that Detroit was well known for the riots of 43 and 67. And while I was working with the sociologist and the geographer and the urban planner, I decided, even though they were documenting all of the indices of racism, I decided that, I'm going to continue to look at racial conflict, but I'm particularly interested in another hypothesis. And I kept asking them, do you think there might be a history of people working together in the post-1943 and the post-1967 riots. And of course, it was a big joke. You know, we would get together in faculty meetings and they would say, come on, Richard, be serious. You know, you just, well, first of all, they said, well, you know, you're a member of the Baha'i Faith and you all belong, you know, you all believe in racial unity and all of that, but you know, don't, you know, you be an idealistic, as they would say in the U.S. Okay. And so I decided that I would explore. And whenever I would arrive at the faculty meeting where we four authors were discussing our research, they would look alarmed. They would say, did you make that up? Were blacks and whites really getting together after the 43 riots? Were they really trying to build bridges after the 67 riots? You have to be wrong. The Current Commission report doesn't say anything about that. And I said, well, you know, I got into some archives and some organizational stuff, and there's some people who've been working on these bridges. And so I started thinking about how I could integrate this perspective into my larger perspective on the history of race relations. And at that time, I started focusing on the 20th century. And there was incredible pushback, as you mentioned. The first pushback came when I was giving a lecture in Toronto on racial cooperation. I decided I would do it in Toronto so no one would know about it. And so I started talking, you know, I just started, you know, experimenting with various historical scenarios. And some people walked out. They were very upset. They said, well, you might be a 20th century historian, but you're making up stuff. When I got back to the department, I never will forget, one of my colleagues said, you know, they broadcast that, and you know, as a young historian, you really need to keep the focus on racism. You know, you wrote that, you know, that Temple University book with your colleagues, had all that good stuff about racial conflict in the schools and all of that. And you really need to stick with that stuff, Richard. That's the important stuff. But I decided that I needed, for the sake of the students who were going to be future scholars, as well as for the sake of trying to understand a usable historical framework that would not ignore the history of racism, but most certainly would point out the very real historical contributions of these people who had been involved in trying to create, you know, bridges and what have you. Several things began to work in my favor. After we did the book in 1987, Detroit, Race and Uneven Development, where my particular piece talked about racial conflict and cooperation, I was asked to visit Warwick University. It was after those riots in the 80s, you remember, in England, various places. And I figured that was also a safe place to try to. And later on, they published a book on urban disorder. But the interesting thing there was that I told them that I would only come and talk about race relations in America if they let me talk about what blacks and whites did after the riots in Detroit of 43 and 67. Okay? And there was some pushback there as well. But they couldn't deny that it had occurred. And the only reason why I wanted to do that is because I wanted people to understand that whenever you have these racial crises, very seldom do you not have at the same time bridge builders, you know, coming up. And so I started taking that into my classes. And there was pushback from the students, understandably. But then I got the students involved based upon this framework and this model. I got the students involved in various kinds of racial projects that later on led to, you all remember the O.J. Simpson's verdict and how people were polarized throughout the States. I finally was able to get a group of students in the wake of that to help form an organization that focused on bringing students together from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, the Racial Unity Resident Program, where we got kids together from different of racial and ethnic groups in the residence halls and started them talking about these issues. Here again, dealing with racism, but at the same time pointing out to them that they had to be change agents in helping to build or to bridge these racial divides. One final thing. I'm looking at you. and one final thing. What Amity and I are trying to do, and we'll be doing it in this primer, is not only documenting the history of this, but also focusing on some very valid examples from which people can begin to think about how can we frame this new period of race relations. We need to look at it in terms of continual racial crises, or we can look at it in conjunction with that in terms of where are the bridge building efforts taking place. And in our latest book, in the book with one of my colleagues at Michigan State University, we look at race relations in Detroit in the post-67 riot era. Because as you all know, Detroit is still one of the most segregated communities in the country. And we've got several chapters in that book that focuses on the brave and courageous efforts of people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds to bridge the racial divide.